4 U.S. presidents owned Pierce Arrows. At its peak, it rivaled Rolls-Royce. By 1938, the entire company was auctioned off for roughly $40,000, less than the price of one of its own cars. Buffalo, New York, 1865. A company called Heinz, Pierce & Munschauer opens its doors. They make bird cages, also ice boxes, bathtubs, and assorted household goods. Not exactly the origin story you'd expect for what would become the most prestigious automobile manufacturer in American history. But that's where it starts. George N. Pierce joined the firm early on and eventually took control, renaming it the George N. Pierce Company. He had a knack for spotting where markets were heading. In the 1890s, bicycles were booming, so Pierce started building bicycles, good ones. I'm the kind that earned a reputation for quality craftsmanship and durability. And then, right around the turn of the century, he spotted the next wave, automobiles. Pierce built his first car around 1901, a small motorette. Nothing fancy. But from the very beginning, the philosophy was different. Pierce wasn't interested in building cars for everyone. He was interested in building the best car, period. Every component was held to standards that most manufacturers wouldn't even consider. Where other early automakers were slapping together engines and frames as fast as they could, Pierce's shop in Buffalo was hand-fitting parts, testing materials, and refusing to cut corners. Now, in those early days of the automobile, there was a real question on every buyer's mind. Would this thing actually work? Cars broke down constantly. Roads were terrible. Reliability wasn't a feature. It was a fantasy. So how did you prove your car was worth buying? You entered the Glidden Tour. The Glidden Tour was the ultimate test of automotive reliability in early America. A grueling multi-day road rally across some of the worst roads the country had to offer. Mud, rocks, hills, river crossings. If your car could survive the Glidden Tour, it could survive anything. Pierce entered his great Arrow model. It didn't just survive, it won. Then it won again, and again. 5 consecutive Glidden Tour victories from 1905 to 1909. No other manufacturer came close. This wasn't advertising copy. This was documented, verified, undeniable proof that Pierce built cars that simply would not quit. That kind of track record gets noticed. In 1909, President William Howard Taft selected Pierce Arrow as the official White House automobile. Think about that. The President of the United States, with access to any car in the world, chose Pierce Arrow. And it wasn't just Taft. Presidents Wilson, Harding, and Coolidge all rode in Pierce Arrows. The brand became synonymous with the highest levels of American power and prestige. The company formally adopted the Pierce Arrow name, and by the 1910s and 20s, owning one meant something very specific. It meant you had arrived, not in the flashy look-at-me way, in the quiet, understated, old-money way. Pierce Arrow owners included titans of industry, foreign dignitaries, and Hollywood royalty. The cars were enormous, beautifully engineered, and built almost entirely by hand. And here's the thing that set Pierce Arrow apart from every other luxury brand. They deliberately limited production. While Ford was churning out millions of Model Ts, Pierce Arrow never built more than a few thousand cars in any given year. Sometimes far fewer. This was intentional. Exclusivity was the product just as much as the car itself. You couldn't just buy a Pierce Arrow because you had money. You bought one because you were the kind of person who owned a Pierce Arrow. The factory in Buffalo employed some of the most skilled craftsmen in the industry. Bodies were hand-formed. Interiors were finished in the finest leather and wood. Engines were individually tested and tuned. In an era when most cars broke down every few miles, Pierce Arrow built machines that could cross the country without complaint. That reputation took decades of meticulous work to build. It would take less than 10 years to destroy. By the 1920s, Pierce Arrow sat at the absolute top of American luxury. The name carried more weight than Cadillac, more prestige than Packard, more reverence than Lincoln. But the company was about to make a series of decisions and have a series of decisions made for it that would prove fatal. Now, here's the thing about prestige. It doesn't pay the bills. And by the mid-1920s, Pierce Arrow had a problem that no amount of reputation could fix. The cars were magnificent. Everyone agreed on that. But magnificence has a cost, and Pierce Arrow's cost structure was brutal. When you're building cars largely by hand, like with master craftsmen shaping body panels and fitting interiors with the kind of care you'd expect from furniture makers, every single unit is expensive to produce. That's fine when you're selling enough of them. Pierce Arrow wasn't. In a good year during the mid-20s, Pierce Arrow might move a few thousand cars. That's it. A few thousand. Meanwhile, Cadillac was pushing tens of thousands out the door. Packard was doing even better. These weren't lesser cars either. Cadillac and Packard were genuine luxury brands with serious engineering and real prestige. But they'd figured out something Pierce Arrow hadn't. You could build a luxury car and still build enough of them to make money. Pierce Arrow treated volume like it was beneath them. The math didn't care about their feelings. Low volume meant high per-unit costs. High per-unit costs meant thin margins. Thin margins meant no money for research, no money for new tooling, no money for the kind of engineering development that keeps a car company competitive. It was a slow spiral, and it was already turning before anyone at Pierce Arrow wanted to admit it. So in 1928, a solution appeared. Studebaker Corporation, a much larger automaker based in South Bend, Indiana, acquired Pierce Arrow. The idea made sense on paper. Studebaker would provide financial stability, shared engineering resources, and the manufacturing scale that Pierce Arrow desperately needed. Pierce Arrow would keep its identity, keep its prestige, and finally have the backing to compete with Cadillac and Packard on equal footing. That was the pitch anyway. The reality was different. Studebaker's management understood mass-market cars. They understood volume. They understood cost per unit and supplier negotiations and assembly line efficiency. What they did not understand was luxury. Not really. Not the way Pierce Arrow's customers understood it. Almost immediately, the pressure started. Build more cars, bring the price down, reach a wider market, expand the customer base. Every one of these directives made perfect sense from a business school perspective. Every one of them was poison for a brand built on exclusivity. And then came the symbolic blow. Pierce Arrow's signature fender-mounted headlights, those distinctive lamps integrated into the front fenders that had defined the brand's look for over a decade, became optional rather than standard. Optional. The single most recognizable design element in American luxury automobiles, the feature that let you identify a Pierce Arrow from a block away. Reduced to a checkbox on an order form. It saved money. It also told the world that Pierce Arrow was no longer fully in control of its own identity. Meanwhile, the competition wasn't standing still. Cadillac introduced its V16 engine in 1930, 16 cylinders. Packard had its elegant twin-six, later the 12. Lincoln was pushing forward with refined V12 power. These brands were investing heavily in multi-cylinder engines and streamlined modern designs. They were looking forward. Pierce Arrow was still relying on engineering that, while solid, was increasingly dated. Their inline six-cylinder engines were well built, sure. But when your competitors are offering 8, a 12 and 16 cylinders, a 6 starts to feel like yesterday's technology, no matter how well it's made. In 1929, Pierce Arrow sold just under 10,000 cars, their best year ever. Sounds healthy, right? But Cadillac sold over 40,000 that same year. Packard sold nearly 50,000. Pierce Arrow's entire annual output was a rounding error for its competitors. The best year in the company's history, and it still wasn't enough. Think of it this way. Imagine being the finest restaurant in America. The food is extraordinary, the service impeccable, the reputation beyond question. Then, a fast food chain buys you, and they tell you to start using cheaper ingredients, serve more customers, turn tables faster, but keep charging premium prices. That's what Pierce Arrow was living through under Studebaker. Then the brand was being pulled in two directions at once, and neither direction led anywhere good. But the late 20s boom masked all of this. Money was flowing, stocks were climbing, wealthy buyers were still buying. The fundamental problems were there, but they were hidden under a layer of prosperity that made everything look manageable. Then October 1929 happened, and everything that was merely problematic became catastrophic. October 1929. The stock market didn't just crash, it evaporated, and with it went the entire world that Pierce Arrow had been built to serve. The luxury car market didn't decline, it collapsed. By 1932, luxury car sales in America had fallen by over 90% from their 1929 peak. 90%. And the people who bought Pierce Arrows didn't stop buying them because they found something better. They stopped buying them because they were broke, or scared, or both. Pierce Arrow's numbers tell the story in brutal shorthand. In 1929, the company sold nearly 10,000 cars. By 1931, that number had dropped below 3,000. By 1932, it was worse. The factory in Buffalo, which had once employed thousands, started laying off workers in waves. Production lines that used to hum around the clock went quiet for days at a time. The company was bleeding cash at a rate that would have killed most businesses in months. And here's where the story gets genuinely strange. Because while the accountants were watching the company die, the engineers were doing some of the best work in Pierce Arrow's entire history. In 1931, right in the teeth of the Depression, Pierce Arrow introduced a V12 engine, not a warmed-over version of something else, a purpose-built, from-scratch 12-cylinder power plant. It was smooth, it was powerful, it was refined in ways that made Cadillac's competing 12 look agricultural. The engineering was world-class. The timing was catastrophic. They were building a luxury engine for a market that no longer existed. It was like designing the world's finest ocean liner while the ocean was draining. But the engineers kept going. They couldn't help themselves. The Silver Arrow. This is the one that still haunts automotive historians. Designed by Philip Wright, it debuted at the 1933 Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago, the World's Fair. Millions of people walking through, looking at visions of the future. And there sat the Silver Arrow, streamlined, futuristic. Enclosed rear fenders, a fastback roofline, flush headlights integrated into the fenders. In 1933, most cars still looked like horse carriages with engines bolted on. The Silver Arrow looked like it had arrived from 1950. People lined up to see it. They couldn't stop staring. Pierce Arrow took orders for 5 of them at $10,000 each. That's roughly $200,000 per car in today's money. They built exactly 5. The tooling cost more than the revenue from all 5 cars combined. It was the most beautiful automobile Pierce Arrow ever produced. It was also a financial disaster, a gorgeous, hand-built monument to a company that was running out of time. The thing is, Studebaker was supposed to be the lifeline. That was the whole point of the 1928 merger. Studebaker would provide the financial stability, the dealer network, the volume manufacturing expertise. Pierce Arrow would provide the prestige. But Studebaker had its own problems. The Depression hit them hard too, and by 1933, Studebaker itself was in receivership. The company that was supposed to save Pierce Arrow couldn't even save itself. So a group of Buffalo businessmen stepped in, local guys, civic pride, personal fortunes, and probably more optimism than the situation warranted. They bought Pierce Arrow back from Studebaker in 1933 for $1 million. That $1 million for a company that had once been worth many times that. They believed they could make it work. Independent again. Back to Buffalo roots. Back to building the finest cars in America. The problem was obvious to everyone, except maybe the people writing the checks. Independence without capital is just a different kind of death sentence. Pierce Arrow was free from Studebaker's sinking ship, sure. But now it was floating on its own with no engine, no fuel, and a hull full of holes. The Buffalo investors had enough money to buy the company. They did not have enough money to run it. Not in a market where your customers had lost everything, where your competitors were slashing prices, where even Packard, the closest thing Pierce Arrow had to appear, was being forced to build cheaper cars just to keep the lights on. The Buffalo buyback gave Pierce Arrow one last chance. But independence without capital is just a slower way to die. So Pierce Arrow bought itself back from Studebaker in 1933. Independent again, free to chart its own course. The problem was, freedom doesn't pay the bills, and Pierce Arrow was nearly broke. The company's leadership knew they couldn't survive selling only to millionaires. The millionaire market had essentially evaporated. So they tried something that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. They introduced less expensive models, Pierce Arrow cars starting around $2,800. Now, $2,800 in the mid-30s was still serious money. That's roughly $60,000 today. But for a company that had been selling cars at $5,000, $8,000, even $10,000, this was a dramatic shift down market. They were trying to reach the upper middle class, doctors, lawyers, successful business owners who wanted prestige but couldn't justify a car that cost more than their house. It made sense on paper, broaden the base, sell more units, generate cash flow, keep the lights on. But here's the thing about going down market when you're a prestige brand. You alienate the wealthy buyers who chose you because you were exclusive, and you still can't compete on price with Cadillac and Packard, who had massive production volumes driving their costs down. Pierce Arrow was stuck in no man's land. Too expensive for the middle market. Not exclusive enough anymore for the ultra-wealthy, and without the production scale to make the math work at any price point. Sales in 1934 came in at roughly 1,700 cars. That sounds bad. It was worse than it sounds. To put that in perspective, Cadillac sold over 7,000 that same year, and even Cadillac was struggling. Packard moved nearly 17,000 units. Pierce Arrow was being outproduced by a factor of 10 by its closest competitor, and the numbers kept dropping. Every single year, fewer cars left the factory on Elmwood Avenue. But here's what makes this story genuinely tragic, rather than just another business failure. While the accountants were watching the company bleed out, the engineers were doing some of the best work in the entire American automobile industry. Carl Wise and his engineering team refused to coast. They developed and patented servo-assisted mechanical brakes that gave drivers stopping power that was years ahead of anything else on the road. They pioneered hydraulic valve lifters for quieter engine operation. If you've ever appreciated a smooth, silent engine idle in a modern car, you can trace part of that lineage back to what Pierce Arrow's engineers were doing in their final years. They weren't gimmicks. They weren't marketing features dressed up as innovation. These were genuine engineering breakthroughs that Cadillac and Packard would adopt years later. The engineers at Pierce Arrow were solving problems the rest of the industry didn't even know it had yet. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. The cruel irony is that the companies who survived long enough to benefit from these innovations were the ones with deeper pockets and bigger dealer networks. Pierce Arrow invented the solutions. Competitors inherited them. That's a pattern you see over and over in engineering history, and it never stops being painful to watch. By 1936, the company was producing fewer than 800 cars a year. The factory that once employed thousands of skilled craftsmen was operating at a fraction of its capacity. Entire sections of the plant sat dark and empty. The remaining workers knew what was coming. Everyone knew, but they kept building cars. And the cars they built were, by virtually every objective measure, among the finest automobiles in the world. That's the part that's hard to reconcile. Pierce Arrow didn't die because it made a bad product. It died because making the best product in the world doesn't matter if you can't sell enough of them to stay solvent. The engineering was flawless, the business model was broken, and no amount of hydraulic valve lifters or servo-assisted brakes could fix a balance sheet that was hemorrhaging cash every single quarter. The last new Pierce Arrow rolled off the line in 1938. The company entered receivership. The factory equipment was auctioned off, the patents were sold. The name that once stood alongside Rolls-Royce as the definition of automotive excellence was simply gone. Now let's talk about what actually made these cars special and why the engineering that should have saved the company actually helped kill it. So let's talk about what was actually under the skin of a Pierce Arrow, because this is where the story gets painful. The engineering wasn't just good, it was arguably too good, and that distinction matters. The heart of their late-era cars was a V12 engine, almost 7 liters of displacement, 175 horsepower. Now, those numbers alone don't tell you much. Cadillac's V16 made 165 horsepower from a bigger engine. Packard's 12 made 160. Pierce Arrow was getting more power from less displacement, and doing it with a smoothness that people at the time described as almost eerie. The dual-valve design gave each cylinder better breathing than most competitors managed with more complex setups. It was a genuinely refined piece of machinery. The kind of engine that engineers admired and accountants feared. But the engine was only part of the problem. The bodies were where things got really expensive. Pierce Arrow used hand-formed aluminum panels over ashwood frames. Every single body was essentially a custom piece. Skilled craftsmen shaped each panel by hand, fitting them to the wooden skeleton with a precision that bordered on obsessive. This wasn't an assembly line process. This was artisan work, the kind of thing you'd see in a European coach building shop, not an American factory trying to survive a depression. Here's where the math starts to hurt. Pierce Arrow's machining tolerances were measured in 10,000ths of an inch. Cadillacs were measured in thousandths. Read that again? Pierce Arrow was working to tolerances 10 times tighter than one of the most respected names in American luxury. And the thing is, no buyer could feel the difference. No passenger sitting in the back seat could tell whether a component was fitted to within 3,000ths or 3/10,000ths. But the production floor could tell. The timesheets could tell. The accountants could absolutely tell. Parts at Pierce Arrow were fitted by hand rather than pulled from bins and bolted on. That meant every car required more skilled labor, more time, and more individual attention than anything coming out of Detroit. A Pierce Arrow took significantly more labor hours to build than a comparable Cadillac or Packard. We're not talking about a small difference. The gap was substantial enough that Pierce Arrow's per-unit cost made profitability nearly impossible at any realistic sales volume. And volume was the whole problem. To justify those production costs, Pierce Arrow needed to charge premium prices. Serious premium prices. But the Depression had eliminated premium buyers. The people who could afford a Pierce Arrow in 1929 were watching their portfolios evaporate by 1932. The market for a car that cost more than most people's houses didn't just shrink, it nearly vanished. Now, Packard faced the same problem, same segment, same clientele disappearing. But Packard did something Pierce Arrow refused to do. In 1935, Packard introduced the 120, a good car, not a great one. It sold for under $1,000. Packard purists were horrified. They called it a betrayal of everything the brand stood for. A Packard for the common man? Disgraceful. But Packard sold nearly 25,000 of them in the first year. 25,000 units. That's more cars than Pierce Arrow sold in its entire final decade. The 120 saved Packard. It kept the lights on, kept the factories running, kept the workforce employed. It gave Packard the cash flow to continue building their prestige models alongside the cheaper ones. Pierce Arrow's board discussed a similar strategy. They actually sat in a room and debated whether to build a lower-priced car that could generate volume. And they decided against it. The reasoning was that it would damage the brand, dilute the prestige, cheapen the name. They were right about the brand. A cheaper Pierce Arrow would have been a contradiction. It would have confused the market and upset loyal customers. On that point, the board's logic was sound. But they were wrong about survival being optional. Prestige doesn't pay bills. A pristine reputation means nothing if the company doesn't exist. Packard compromised and lived. Pierce Arrow held firm and died. The 120 wasn't elegant strategy, it was triage, and Pierce Arrow refused the tourniquet. The cruel irony is that Pierce Arrow's engineering was genuinely world-class. Those tolerances, that hand-fitted aluminum, that silky V12, all of it represented the absolute peak of American automotive craftsmanship. Rolls-Royce didn't work to tighter standards. Nobody did. Pierce Arrow built some of the finest automobiles ever made on American soil, and every single one of them lost money. All of this engineering brilliance couldn't prevent what came next. The final collapse happened faster than anyone expected. The last Pierce Arrow rolled off the assembly line in 1938. Not with fanfare, not with ceremony, just quietly, like a patient whose family had already left the hospital room. The company had been in receivership since '37, and everyone knew it was over. They'd known for a while. But there's a difference between knowing something is dying and watching it actually stop breathing. Then came the auction. The massive factory complex on Elmwood Avenue in Buffalo, a facility that had produced some of the finest automobiles ever built in America, was stripped bare. And I mean bare. Custom-built machine tools, equipment designed specifically for Pierce Arrow's precision standards, on things that took years to develop and calibrate, sold as scrap metal. Patterns and dies that represented decades of accumulated engineering knowledge melted down. The entire physical infrastructure of a company that once built cars for presidents, for titans of industry, for royalty, liquidated for what some reports say was as little as $40,000 total. $40,000 for everything, the tools, the dies, the remaining parts inventory, the fixtures. A company that had once been valued in the tens of millions reduced to a number that wouldn't have bought one of its own cars in the good years. That's not a liquidation, that's an erasure. But the equipment was just metal. The real loss was human. An estimated 3,000 workers had already been laid off by the time the doors closed for good. Our 3,000 skilled craftsmen in Buffalo, New York during the Great Depression. These weren't people who could just walk across the street and get hired somewhere else. These were specialists, hand fitters who could feel tolerances with their fingertips, finishers who knew techniques passed down through 20 years on the factory floor, engine assemblers who understood Pierce Arrow's inline 6s and 8s the way a surgeon understands anatomy. And all of that institutional knowledge, every bit of it, evaporated overnight. The hand-fitting techniques, the finishing processes, the engineering shortcuts that only the workers knew, the little tricks that never made it into any manual because they lived in the hands and heads of the people doing the work. Gone. You can auction off a building. You can melt down a die. But you can't recover what people carried in their muscle memory. Buffalo's economy, already reeling from the Depression, took another devastating blow. The city had been proud of Pierce Arrow. It was their brand, their identity, proof that Buffalo could produce something world-class. When the factory went dark, it wasn't just an economic loss. It was a psychological one. Buffalo wouldn't fully recover for decades. Some would argue it never entirely did. The brand name itself was purchased after the bankruptcy, and over the following decades, multiple attempts were made to revive it. None succeeded. Turns out, a name without the people, the tools, and the culture behind it is just a word. You can buy a trademark. You can't buy back what made it mean something. Now, Pierce Arrow's death reshaped the American luxury car landscape in ways that are still visible. With Pierce Arrow gone, the surviving prestige brands were Packard, Cadillac, and Lincoln. That was it. 3 names left standing where there had once been half a dozen serious contenders. And here's the thing. Packard, the brand most similar to Pierce Arrow in philosophy and market position, would follow the exact same path to extinction by 1958. Same story, different decade. Prestige brand tries to go down market to survive, dilutes its identity, loses its core customers, and dies. Pierce Arrow was the warning. Packard didn't listen. Cadillac survived because it had General Motors behind it. Lincoln survived because it had Ford. The independents, the companies that stood on their own reputation and nothing else. They all eventually fell. Every single one. And many of Pierce Arrow's innovations, the engineering breakthroughs they pioneered, lived on in other manufacturers' cars, without credit. The power braking concepts, the engine mounting techniques, the headlight integration ideas, other companies adopted them, refined them, and nobody remembered where they came from. That's the final indignity of being first. If you don't survive long enough, someone else gets the credit. The factory that built cars for presidents became an empty shell in less than a decade. The workers scattered, the tools were scrapped, the knowledge disappeared, and the American auto industry learned absolutely nothing from it, at least not yet. So what does the death of Pierce Arrow actually mean for us today? More than you might think. So here's the thing about Pierce Arrow's collapse. It wasn't unique. It was a pattern, and it's a pattern that keeps repeating decade after decade in luxury markets around the world. Look at Aston Martin. Beautiful cars. Legendary name. They've gone bankrupt 7 times. 7. The company that built James Bond's car cannot figure out how to stay solvent. Bentley nearly died in the Depression, too. They survived only because Rolls-Royce bought them in 1931 for a fraction of what they were worth. And even Rolls-Royce, the gold standard of automotive prestige, only made it through because they had something Pierce Arrow didn't. Aircraft engines, diversification, a revenue stream that didn't depend on wealthy people buying luxury sedans during the worst economic crisis in modern history. Pierce Arrow made cars. That's it. Beautiful, hand-built, meticulously engineered cars. And when the car market collapsed, they had no parachute, no military contracts, no industrial division, no aircraft program, nothing to fall back on. Just a factory full of craftsmen building machines that nobody could afford to buy. Tesla nearly died the same way, by the way. In 2008, they were weeks from bankruptcy. 1 car, no diversification, no profit. The difference is, Elon Musk found financing at the last possible moment. Pierce Arrow's investors in 1938 did not. Sometimes survival comes down to timing and luck, as much as engineering talent. The core lesson is brutal in its simplicity. Engineering excellence without business adaptability is a death sentence. You can build the finest product in your industry. You can win every comparison test. You can have the most loyal customers and the most respected name. None of that matters if your business model can't survive a downturn. Prestige is not a strategy, it's a byproduct. Business schools actually teach Pierce Arrow now, not as an engineering case study, as a cautionary tale about confusing brand value with financial sustainability. About what happens when a company's identity becomes so tied to exclusivity that it literally cannot scale down without destroying what makes it special. Now, the cars themselves, they survive better than the company did. The Pierce Arrow Society tracks roughly 1,700 known surviving vehicles worldwide. They show up at Pebble Beach, at Amelia Island, at the finest concours events on the planet where they still turn heads 90 years after the factory closed. And the values are something else. A 1933 Silver Arrow, one of the 5 ever built, last traded hands for well over $300,000 at auction. Think about that for a second. The car that the company lost money building, the show car that cost more to produce than it could ever sell for, is now worth more than the entire Pierce Arrow company sold for at its final bankruptcy auction. The market eventually recognized what Pierce Arrow's accountants couldn't afford to wait for. If you could buy a single car that tells the entire story of American ambition, engineering genius, and catastrophic business failure in one object, it would be a Pierce Arrow. And that brings us back to where we started. So let's come back to where we started. 4 United States presidents owned Pierce Arrow automobiles. The White House kept them in the motor pool. Foreign dignitaries were chauffeured in them. They were, by nearly every measure, the finest cars America ever produced. And in 1938, the entire company, every tool, every die, every piece of equipment, every patent, every drawing, all of it, sold at auction for less than the price of a single Pierce Arrow Silver Arrow show car. $40,000 for everything. The factory in Buffalo is still there, sort of. The buildings got carved up, repurposed, turned into commercial properties. There's no plaque, no monument, no museum dedicated to the company that built America's most prestigious automobiles for over 3 decades. If you drove past the site today, you wouldn't know. Nothing about it says that some of the most beautifully engineered cars in history were assembled right there. The cars themselves survive. Maybe a few hundred scattered across private collections and museums around the world. Each one is worth more now than the company sold for at auction. Let that sit for a second. Pierce Arrow didn't fail because it made bad cars. It didn't fail because it ignored engineering or cut corners or lost its way creatively. It failed because it couldn't reconcile being the best with staying alive. The refusal to compromise was the thing that made Pierce Arrow special. It was also the thing that killed it. Same trait, same outcome. That's not irony, that's a trap. And once you're in it, there's no clean way out. You either dilute what makes you great, or you die being great. Pierce Arrow chose the second option. Whether that was noble or just stubborn depends on who you ask. The company is just a story now, this story. So that's Pierce Arrow, a company that made cars too good for its own survival. If you know of another brand that engineered itself into extinction, Packard, Duesenberg, Tucker, whoever, drop it in the comments. I want to hear those stories. And if you made it this far, subscribe. We do these every week.